Somerset, June 1819. The engagement ball was 3 hours away when Iloan Thackeray went looking for her sister. She had a reason, a good one, the kind of reason that required telling someone immediately and telling the right someone first. She had confirmed it that morning with the physician her father kept in Bridgewater, a quiet man with steady hands who had said the words with the careful neutrality of a professional delivering information he understood was significant. She was with child, 6 weeks, perhaps 7. Early enough that nothing showed, late enough that the physician was certain. She had sat in the carriage on the way back to Thornfield Hall and placed her hand flat against her stomach and thought about what it meant. She was 23. She was engaged to the Duke of Thornfield. The ball announcing their betrothal to the county was tonight, and she was carrying his child, and she wanted to tell Jessamine before she told anyone, because Jessamine was her sister and her closest confidant, and the person whose face she wanted to see when she said the words aloud for the first time. She found a footman in the East Corridor who told her Miss Jessamine had gone to the music room. She thanked him and walked through the long gallery with its portraits of vain ancestors, generations of Thornfield dukes looking down from gilt frames with the settled certainty of men who had never questioned their position in the world. And she thought, not for the first time, about what it would mean to join this family, to belong to this house, to raise a child in these corridors beneath these portraits. She had been considered for this position because of her father's shipping fortune and her own steady temperament. Oswin Thackeray had built one of the largest merchant fleets on the western coast, and his eldest daughter had inherited his talent for assessment and his habit of reading situations the way other people read weather. Instinctively, constantly, and with reliable accuracy. She reached the music room door. It was not fully closed. She heard Jessamine's laugh first. It was the private laugh, not the one her sister used in drawing rooms and at dinner tables, but the unguarded one, the one that belonged to the version of Jessamine that existed only with people she trusted entirely. Iloan stopped. She did not stop because of the laugh. She stopped because of the voice that followed it, low and familiar, saying her sister's name in a register she recognized. She recognized it because it was the register he used with her in the evenings, in the garden, when they were alone, and the performance of courtship had softened into something she had believed was genuine. She stood at the door that was not fully closed, and she listened for 4 seconds, which was long enough to understand everything, and not long enough to be a choice she had made. Then she pushed the door open. The music room at Thornfield Hall had tall windows that faced the west garden, and in the late afternoon light of June, the room had the quality of a painting, golden and still and composed. Iloan registered this detail the way she registered all details, automatically, with the part of her mind that cataloged information whether she wanted it to or not. Jessamine was standing at the pianoforte. Aldrich was standing beside her. His hand was on her jaw, his thumb against her cheekbone, and her sister's fingers were resting on the lapel of his coat. And they were close enough that the distance between them was not a distance at all. They were not kissing. They had been, or they were about to, and the distinction did not matter. Iloan looked at the scene with the complete attention she brought to everything that told her something true about a person. She looked at Jessamine's hand on his coat, the familiarity of it, the comfort. Not the touch of a first transgression, the touch of a practiced one. She looked at Aldrich's hand on her sister's face, the tenderness in it, the possession. She looked at the angle of their bodies, angled toward each other with the ease of 2 people who had learned each other's geometry. She noted these things in the 4 seconds before they saw her. She noted them the way her father noted a failing venture, with clarity and the absolute refusal to mistake what she was seeing for something more manageable. Jessamine saw her first. Her sister's expression moved through 3 stages in a single breath: surprise, recognition. And then the one Elowen would remember longest. A flicker of something that was not guilt. It was closer to resignation, the expression of someone who had been waiting for this moment and had already decided what it meant. Aldrich turned a half-second later. He dropped his hand from Jessamine's face. It was the only hurried thing she had ever seen him do. "Elowen," he said. She looked at him. She looked at the man she had agreed to marry, the man whose child she was carrying at this precise moment, standing in a wash of golden light beside her sister, with his hand still remembering the shape of Jessamine's jaw. She thought about the physician in Bridgewater that morning, the careful words, the steady hands. She thought about her palm pressed flat against her stomach in the carriage. She thought about walking through the gallery past the vain portraits, thinking about raising a child in these corridors, she thought, with the precision she brought to all important information, that some rooms tell you everything you need to know in 4 seconds, and that the merciful thing about 4 seconds was that they did not leave space for self-deception. "How long?" she said. The question was directed at Jessamine. She had learned early in her father's business that the person who was not in command of the situation was the one more likely to answer honestly. Jessamine looked at the floor. "Elowen. It was never meant to." "How long?" "Since April," Jessamine said. "Since the house party at Langton." April. The house party at Langton, where Elowen had been ill for 2 days with a fever and had stayed in her room, while Jessamine and Aldrich and the rest of the party had gone riding on the hills. She had been grateful, she remembered, that Jessamine was there to make conversation in her absence. She had thanked her sister for it afterward. She processed this information the way she processed all important discoveries, which was to say, she absorbed it entirely and deferred the pain. The pain was there. She could feel its exact dimensions somewhere beneath her ribs, but it was underneath, waiting, the kind that would not arrive fully until she was alone and had given it permission. Aldrich stepped forward. "This is not what it appears." She looked at him with the calm, focused attention that had been her defining quality since she was 15. She had been told by her father that this quality unnerved people. She had never found a reason to soften it. "It is exactly what it appears," she said. "That is why you said that." He stopped. She watched him stop. She watched the sentence he had been constructing collapse behind his eyes, and she catalogued that too. The precise moment when a man who had always controlled every room he entered understood that this room had moved beyond his management. Jessamine was crying. Elowen noted this with the detached attention of a woman who was not going to cry. Not here. Not in front of these windows with their golden light and their portrait-quality composition. Elowen looked at the ring on her left hand. She had worn it for 11 weeks. It was a vine ring, old and beautiful, set with a sapphire that had belonged to 3 previous Duchesses of Thornfield. Aldrich had presented it with the seriousness of a man offering a contract, and she had accepted it with the seriousness of a woman who understood exactly what it represented. She understood now what it represented differently. She removed it. Not quickly. Not with the theatrical gesture of a woman performing her own exit. She slid it from her finger with the same deliberate care with which she had accepted it, and she held it for 1 moment in her closed palm, and then she set it on the lid of the pianoforte. The sound of it was small, a faint tap of gold and sapphire on polished wood. It was, she thought, the quietest, significant sound she had ever heard. "Elowen," Aldrich said, "let me explain." She looked at him. "You have explained," she said. "April, the house party at Langton, your hand on her face in a room you did not bother to close the door of. You have explained everything with considerable thoroughness." She looked at Jessamine, who was standing at the pianoforte with tears on her face and the ring beside her on the polished lid. She wanted to say something to her sister. She wanted to say, "You are the person I came here to tell first." She wanted to say, "I was carrying the news of his child to you as a gift, because you were the person I trusted most in the world." She did not say any of this. She recognized, with the instinct for self-preservation that had governed her since childhood, that some information once given could never be retrieved, and that the child she was carrying was no longer information that belonged in this room. "The ball tonight," she said instead, and her voice was steady, and she was distantly proud of its steadiness. "You will need to make an announcement. I leave the explanation to your creativity." She turned toward the door. She walked with the measured pace of a woman who was not fleeing. She was not fleeing. She was leaving, which was a different action entirely, and she had understood the difference for years, ever since she had first learned that a woman who leaves a room under her own power has not been driven from it. At the doorway, she paused. She did not turn back. "Jessamine," she said, "he will do this to you as well. When he does, you will remember this afternoon, and you will understand that I was not the one who was discarded. I was the one who set something down." She walked through the long gallery past the vain portraits, past the gilt frames, and the settled certainty of men who had never questioned their position, and out through the front entrance, where her carriage was still waiting in the June light, because she had expected to return to her father's house for her ball gown. She climbed into the carriage. She placed her hand flat against her stomach, the same gesture from that morning, the same hand that had held the ring and then released it. She said to the driver, "Home, please." The carriage pulled away from Thornfield Hall. She did not look back at the house. She looked ahead at the Somerset Road and the evening light on the hills and the future she had been expecting 3 hours ago, which was no longer the future she was going to have. She was carrying a secret that the Duke of Thornfield did not know, and she decided in the carriage, somewhere between the Thornfield gates and the first turning of the road, that he was never going to. 5 years. 5 years is long enough to build a life that doesn't reference the previous one. Alawan had done this with the systematic attention she brought to everything, constructing a new existence the way her father built ships. Keel first, frame second. Every plank fitted before the next was laid. She had returned to her father's house in Bristol on that June evening in 1819, with the ring gone from her hand and the secret intact beneath it. And she had told Oswin Thackeray 3 things. The engagement was ended, the reason was sufficient, and she did not wish to discuss it further. Her father, who had spent 23 years paying close attention to his daughter, had looked at her face and asked no questions. He had poured her a glass of wine and sat with her in the study while she drank it, and the silence between them had been the particular silence of a man who understood that his daughter would tell him what she needed to tell him when she was ready, and not before. She told him about the child in August, when the evidence had made concealment impractical. He had received the information with the same steady attention with which he received all significant intelligence, and had said, after a long pause, "What do you need?" She had needed several things: privacy, distance from Somerset, a house of her own in Bristol, where a child could be born without the county's attention. Her father provided all of them without commentary and without conditions, because Oswin Thackeray had understood early that his eldest daughter's mind was the sharpest instrument in his household, and had never hesitated to let her use it. Emmerich was born in February of 1820 in the house on Queen Square in Bristol, in a snowstorm that had shut the harbor and silenced the city. He had his mother's dark hair and his father's gray eyes, and Alawan had looked at him in the first hour and understood 2 things with absolute clarity: that she would build the world around this child, and that the man whose eyes he carried would never know he existed. She had kept both promises. In the 5 years since, she had taken increasing control of her father's shipping operations. First the Western routes, then the Bristol accounts, then the full management of the Thackeray fleet. 16 vessels running wool and tin and grain between the western ports and the continent. Oswin's health had begun its slow retreat in 1822, and by 1824, Elowen was running the company in all but name. Emmerich grew. He grew the way children grow when they are loved without anxiety and raised with both warmth and structure. He had his mother's habit of watching rooms carefully before entering them, and his father's stillness, a quality Elowen noticed and did not remark on, and occasionally looked at in the evening light, with an attention she kept entirely private. In the autumn of 1824, she purchased Staverton House. It was a handsome property 3 miles south of Colburn Harbor on the Somerset coast, with good land, a working farm, and direct access to the harbor road that connected the port to the inland estates. It was, from a business perspective, the ideal base for the Western Fleet operations. It was also 11 miles from Thornfield Hall. She told her father it was a commercial decision. Oswin, whose health was failing, but whose attention had not diminished by a single degree, looked at her from behind the Bristol accounts and said, 11 miles. The harbor access is unmatched on this stretch of coast, she said. 11 miles from Thornfield, he said. The harbor, father. The harbor is the asset. He looked at her with the expression of a man who had watched his daughter leave Thornfield Hall 5 years ago with a ring missing from her hand and a secret held beneath it, and who had spent every year since noting the quality of her composure whenever Somerset was mentioned. He said nothing further. He did not need to. She moved to Staverton House in October with Emmerich and Mrs. Calloway, who had managed the Bristol household since Emmerich's birth and who understood the situation with the comprehensive discretion of a woman who had been keeping households and their secrets for 30 years. And Somerset, which was a county that noticed things, noticed her arrival with the interested attention of a place that remembered what had happened 5 Junes ago and was curious about what was going to happen next. The Duke of Thornfield learned of her return the way he learned most things about the county, from his steward, mentioned in passing during the weekly estate review, delivered with the careful neutrality of a man who understood which information was routine and which was not. The Staverton property has been purchased, his steward said. A Miss Thackeray, the shipping family from Bristol. The steward watched the Duke's hand pause on the ledger. It was a small pause. A man less attentive would have missed it entirely. Elowen Thackeray, the Duke said. Yes, Your Grace. She took possession last week. There is a child, I understand. A boy. The Duke said nothing. He returned to the ledger. The steward noted this silence and the particular quality of it, and continued with the review, and did not raise the subject again. Their first meeting was not arranged by either party, which meant it was arranged by Somerset, which had its own opinions about proximity and timing, and was not above engineering a coincidence when it judged one necessary. The quarterly Harbor Commission met at the Anchor Inn in Colburn on the first Thursday of November. The Duke attended because Thornfield had held a seat on the commission for 90 years. Elowen attended because the Thackeray fleet now represented the largest commercial operation in the harbor, and she had no intention of allowing her interests to be represented by anyone other than herself. She arrived first. She sat at the long table in the private room with her harbor accounts and her cargo manifests, and the composure of a woman who had been managing rooms full of men since she was 18, and had never once found the experience novel enough to be intimidating. He arrived 7 minutes later. She heard his voice in the corridor before she saw him, speaking to the harbor master about the channel depth, and she had 4 seconds, the same number as in the music room 5 years ago, to prepare for what she was about to feel. He came through the door. He was older, not significantly, but in the way that 5 years lands on a face that has been carrying something it did not discuss. There were lines at the corners of his eyes that had not been there in June of 1819. His bearing was the same. the quality of a man who had been managing large rooms since he was 20. But there was something less certain in it now, a fracture in the bearing that she noted immediately and without mercy. He saw her. She watched him see her. She watched the recognition, and then the recalibration, and then the effort of a man assembling his composure in real time, rather than arriving with it already in place. "Miss Thackeray," he said. "Your Grace," she said. She did not stand. They were seated at a commission table. Standing would have been social. This was professional, and she intended the distinction to be visible. He sat at the opposite end of the table. The harbor master and 3 other commissioners filled the space between them, and the meeting proceeded with the ordinary business of harbor management, channel maintenance, mooring fees, the condition of the South Breakwater after the autumn storms. Allowance spoke when the agenda required it, with the precision of a woman who had memorized every relevant figure and was not performing her competence for anyone's benefit. She was aware, during her remarks on the cargo tonnage projections, that the Duke was watching her with an attention she recognized from another room in another year. The complete assessing attention. But it was different now. 5 years ago, it had been the attention of a man who believed he already understood what he was looking at. Now, it was the attention of a man who understood that he did not. The meeting concluded. The commissioners dispersed with the unhurried efficiency of men who had business elsewhere and opinions to share about what they had just witnessed. Allawan gathered her papers. She was aware that the Duke had not left. "You have returned to Somerset," he said from the far end of the table. "I have purchased property in Somerset," she said, without looking up from her documents. "The distinction is relevant. The Staverton estate." "Staverton House," she corrected. "It is not an estate. It is a working property with harbor access, which serves the requirements of my fleet." "Your fleet?" She looked up. "My fleet," she said. 16 vessels, western routes and continental trade. My father's health no longer permits active management, and I have been running the operation for 2 years. She held his gaze. "You seem surprised." "I am not surprised," he said, and the way he said it suggested that the surprise wasn't about the fleet, but about something else entirely. Something he was not going to name in a room where the harbor master might return for his forgotten hat. She stood. She collected her papers. She was aware of him watching her hands as she organized the documents, and she was aware that he was looking at her left hand, at the ring finger that had been bare for 5 years, and she let him look because the absence of the ring was its own statement, and she had no intention of softening it. "Good afternoon, Your Grace," she said. "Miss Thackeray," he said. And there was something in the way he said her name that had not been there 5 years ago, something that lived in the space between what he had done and what he was only now beginning to understand. He had lost. She walked out of the Anchor Inn and into the November air and did not look back, and the quality of not looking back was different now than it had been in June of 1819, because then it had been survival, and now it was a choice, and she understood the difference entirely. The November storms arrived in the 3rd week, the kind of weather the Somerset coast produced when it intended to remind everyone that the sea was not a commercial convenience, but a force with its own opinions about human planning. 3 days of sustained wind and rain, and when it cleared, the harbor road between Colburn and the inland estates was impassable in 2 places. The stone bridge at Halford Crossing had partially collapsed, and 40 tons of Thornfield grain sat in the estate barns, with no route to the harbor and no ship to carry it. Allawan's ships sat in Colburn Harbor, with no cargo to carry, and crews drawing wages for idle days, which was the kind of arithmetic she took personally. The bridge at Halford Crossing was the problem. It spanned the River Halford at the point where Staverton Land met the Thornfield boundary, and it was the only route between the inland farms and the harbor that could bear the weight of loaded wagons. Without the bridge, Thornfield's harvest rotted in its barns, and Alohan's ships sat empty in the harbor, and both losses compounded by the day. She wrote to the Duke on a Monday morning. The letter was factual, specific, and without social padding. The bridge at Halford Crossing required joint repair. The cost should be shared proportionate to usage. She proposed a meeting at the bridge site on Wednesday to assess the damage and agree on a plan. His reply arrived Monday evening, which was faster than professional correspondence required. It was in his own hand, which she noted. It said, Wednesday, 10. I will bring my surveyor. Thornfield. She noted the absence of pleasantries. She noted the efficiency of it. She found this, against her better judgment, less objectionable than courtesy would have been. Wednesday was cold and sharp in the way of late November on the Somerset coast, the kind of morning where the air smelled of salt and wet stone and everything was precisely itself. She arrived at the bridge at 10 minutes before the hour with her foreman and the harbor engineer. She had engaged from Bristol, a man named Sorrell, who had rebuilt half the bridges in the western counties and charged accordingly. The Duke was already there. He was on foot, standing at the edge of the collapsed section, looking at the damage with the focused attention she recognized. His surveyor stood beside him with plans and measuring chains. The Duke wore a heavy wool coat built for weather rather than appearance, which was a detail she noticed and immediately set aside as irrelevant. Your Grace, she said. Miss Thackeray. They stood on opposite sides of the collapsed bridge and looked at the gap between them, which was both structural and otherwise, and she thought, with the precision she could not turn off even when she wanted to, that there was something efficient about the geography of this moment. Sorrell assessed the damage. The Duke's surveyor assessed it independently. The two professionals consulted with the collegial respect of men who spoke the same technical language and arrived at the same conclusion. 6 weeks of work. New stone from the Quantock quarry, a temporary timber crossing to restore wagon traffic while the permanent repair proceeded. The cost, Alohan said, looking at Sorrell's preliminary estimate, should be divided equally, the Duke said. The bridge serves both properties. The bridge serves my harbor access and your export route, she said. The usage is not equal. 70% of the wagon traffic is Thornfield grain. I propose a 70-30 division. He looked at her. She looked at him. The November wind moved through the river valley between them. 60-40, he said. The harbor benefits from the cargo regardless of origin. Your vessels profit from my grain as much as my estate profits from your ships. She considered this. It was a reasonable counter. It was, she noted, also the position of a man who was negotiating with her rather than instructing her, which was a category of interaction he had not offered 5 years ago. 60-40, she agreed, with joint oversight of the construction. Agreed. She extended her hand across the gap where the bridge had been. He looked at it. She watched him look at her hand, the bare ring finger, the ink stain at the edge of her cuff that she had stopped trying to remove in November, and she watched him absorb this information. The hand that had once worn his ring, the hand that now signed shipping contracts and managed a fleet and was extended across a broken bridge with the directness of a woman conducting business. He shook it. The grip was brief and firm, and exactly what it had been the last time their hands had met, which was when he had placed the sapphire ring on her finger 11 weeks before taking it off became necessary. Neither of them mentioned this. Both of them knew it. The temporary crossing, she said, releasing his hand. My foreman can begin Thursday. I will send men to assist, he said. He paused. He was looking at something behind her, toward the Staverton Road, where her carriage waited. Beside the carriage, Mrs. Calloway was standing with a small boy who was watching the river with the focused stillness of a child who found moving water more interesting than adult conversation. Your son, the Duke said. It was not a question. His steward had mentioned the boy. But his voice did something on the word that she registered immediately, a slight catch, the kind of imperfection in a man's composure that meant the composure was costing him something. Yes, she said. Emmerich. He looked at the boy for a moment longer than the information required. Then he looked back at her, with an expression she had not seen before, one that was not the assessing attention and not the managed composure, but something underneath both, something she was going to have to think about later, and carefully. "Good morning, Miss Thackeray," he said. "Good morning, Your Grace." She walked back toward the carriage and her son and the rest of the life she had built without him, and she did not look back, and the not looking back was getting harder, which she noted and did not intend to account for. The Christmas assembly at Hartfield Manor was the county's principal winter gathering. 45 people in the long dining room, the candles reflecting off silver and crystal, and the polished social machinery of a Somerset winter. Elowen had been received with increasing interest over the 2 months since her arrival, as the county had observed her management of the harbor operations and the Halford Bridge repair, and the general conduct of a woman who ran a shipping fleet with the same focused attention that their wives brought to households, and had concluded, with varying degrees of comfort, that she was someone who required a position in the local order. She arrived with Lady Ashgrove, a widow of 62, who had occupied the largest house in Colburn for 3 decades, and who had decided, sometime in November, that Elowen Thackeray was interesting enough to warrant her investment. Lady Ashgrove's investment took the form of appearing at events together, which in Somerset society was a declaration that required no words and permitted no contradiction. The Duke was there. He was across the room when she entered, in conversation with 2 landowners about the harbor channel dredging, and he looked up when she arrived with the attention she had stopped pretending not to notice. The evening proceeded as these evenings did. The circuits of conversation, the careful navigation of a county performing its relationships in a public room. She talked with the Hartfield family about the spring shipping schedule. She talked with the rector's wife about the school in Colburn that needed a new roof. She talked with the harbor master about the tonnage projections, and the Duke appeared beside the harbor master at some point during this conversation and stayed, and the 3 of them discussed cargo rates until the harbor master was called away by his wife, and then it was the 2 of them, and the conversation shifted without either of them directing it from cargo to the bridge, repair to the stone from the Quantock quarry, and from the quarry to a question he asked about the Bristol operation she had built. That was the second question he had asked her about herself rather than about business. She answered it. He listened with the complete attention she had come to expect from him, and she thought about what it meant to be listened to by a man who had once stopped listening before she had started speaking. Lord Bramwell arrived at her left shoulder. She had been aware of him for the better part of an hour. He was a baronet of 57, a man whose family had been in Somerset for 200 years, and who wore this fact with the visible satisfaction of someone who considered longevity a form of achievement. He had been circling the room with the purposeful drift of a man choosing his moment, and he had chosen it now, with 4 people within hearing distance, and the Duke beside her. "Miss Thackeray," he said, with the warmth of a man about to say something that was not warm. "Your harbor enterprise is the talk of the county. Quite remarkable, a woman managing commercial vessels." "Thank you," she said. "The fleet has performed well this quarter." "Indeed. 16 ships, I am told. A considerable operation for—" He paused, with the practiced timing of a man who had been constructing these pauses for decades, "for a woman in your circumstances." He let the word circumstances do its work. In another mouth, it was neutral. In his, with his pause and his audience, and the slight inclination of his head toward the room, it meant the child, the absent husband, the broken engagement 5 years ago, the entire weight of judgment that a county held in reserve for women who did not fit its established categories. My circumstances, Elowen said, are that I manage a profitable fleet, employ 47 men, and have contributed more to this harbor's revenue in 2 months than any single operator in the previous 3 years. Bramwell's smile held. Of course, one merely wonders whether the, shall we say, domestic arrangement is entirely suited to the demands of such an enterprise. A young child, no established household in the county, the question of long-term stability. The Harbor Commission prefers its operators to have a certain permanence. The room had acquired the particular quality of a room that is listening while pretending not to. Elowen was formulating her response, and it was going to be comprehensive when the Duke's voice came from her right. "The Thackeray fleet," the Duke said, in a register she had not heard before. Not the commission voice, not the bridge negotiation voice. The one underneath, the one that carried the weight of a title that had been in Somerset longer than Bramwell's family had been in England, and knew precisely what that weight could do when applied, has resolved a cargo backlog that has cost this county £600 in spoiled grain over the past 2 harvests. He looked at Bramwell with an attention that had nothing social in it. The bridge repair at Halford Crossing, which Miss Thackeray initiated and co-financed, has restored the only viable route between the inland estates and the harbor. My estate included. He paused. The Harbor Commission's preference, Lord Bramwell, is for operators who solve problems. I believe we are all agreed on that. The pause after this was the kind that rearranged a room. Bramwell's smile performed a rapid adjustment. Naturally, I merely wish to express my admiration for. You have expressed it, the Duke said, with the brevity of a man whose title did the work that volume did for lesser men. And the county has heard it. He returned to the conversation as though nothing had occurred. Bramwell found someone else to talk to with the efficiency of a man who needed distance from the place where he had just been corrected. And Elowen stood beside the Duke in the aftermath and thought about what had just happened with the precision she brought to all important information. She thought about the weight of what he had said and how he had said it. She thought about the fact that he had not made her a cause or a project, but had simply placed accurate information into a room being given inaccurate impressions, and had done it in a way that left her standing exactly where she had been standing, undiminished and unrescued. She thought, he knows what he did. She thought, he is waiting to see what I do with it. She excused herself from the group and crossed to Lady Ashgrove, who was standing near the fireplace with a glass of wine and the expression of a woman who had watched the entire exchange with the invested attention of someone who had been waiting for it. "Well," Lady Ashgrove said. "He intervened," Elowen said. "I saw. He did not need to. I was about to respond." "I know you were," Lady Ashgrove said. "And your response would have been devastating and precise and entirely sufficient. And he spoke before you could deliver it." She sipped her wine. "Which tells you something. It tells me he overstepped. It tells you he could not bear to watch it continue for another sentence." Lady Ashgrove looked across the room at the Duke, who was in conversation and was not looking in their direction. "I have known that man since he was a boy of 12, inheriting a title and a house, and the weight of both before he had the shoulders for it. I watched him court you. I watched him lose you. I watched what happened afterward." Elowen looked at her. "He ended things with Jessamine within the month," Lady Ashgrove said. "You knew that." "I had heard. He has not courted anyone since. He has not looked at anyone the way he is carefully not looking at you right now." She set her glass down. "Bramwell is a fool, but he is a useful fool, because the Duke's response to Bramwell told this room something that 5 years of silence had left ambiguous. And what did it tell the room? That whatever happened in June of 1819, the Duke of Thornfield considers Elowyn Thackeray someone worth defending. In this county, that is not a small piece of information. Elowyn looked across the room. The Duke was talking to the Hartfield family. His composure was intact. Nothing about his manner indicated he had done something significant 3 minutes ago. But she could see, with the attention she had developed over 2 months of proximity, the slight difference in his bearing, the quality of a man who had said what he intended and was not going to revisit it. He made it about the fleet, Elowyn said. About the harbor. He made it about business. Yes, Lady Ashgrove said. So that Bramwell had no graceful reply, so that the room understood his position without a personal declaration, and so that you were defended without being diminished. She paused. That requires a very specific kind of care. Elowyn held her glass and thought about 5 years of building a life without him, and the careful structure of self-reliance she had constructed, and the unsettling discovery that someone standing beside her did not weaken the structure, but revealed where she had overbuilt it. He was wrong about me, she said. In June, in the music room, everything he chose in that room was wrong. Yes, Lady Ashgrove said, and he has known it for considerably longer than you have been back in Somerset. She stood. The boy, she said quietly. Emmerich. Elowyn looked at her. I am an old woman with good eyes, Elowyn. The child has his father's stillness and his father's gray eyes, and I have said nothing because it is not my information to distribute. But you should know that I am not the only person in this county with good eyes. She left Elowyn standing by the fireplace with a wine glass and a truth she had been carrying for 5 years, and the sudden understanding that the walls she had built around it were not as solid as she had believed. He came to Staverton House on a Tuesday morning, 4 days after the assembly, which was deliberate enough to mean he had thought about it, and soon enough to mean he had decided. She was in the study when Mrs. Calloway showed him in. She had chosen to receive him in the study because it was where she worked, and because she wasn't going to arrange a drawing room for the Duke of Thornfield, as though this were a social call. It was not a social call. She did not yet know what it was. He stood in the doorway of her study and looked at the room, the shipping ledgers on the desk, the harbor charts on the wall, the correspondence stacked with the organized precision of a woman who did not have time for things that were not functional. May I sit? He said. Yes. He sat across from her desk. She did not offer tea. She waited because she had learned from her father that the person who speaks first in an important conversation reveals what they are prepared to give. I have come to say something I should have said 5 years ago, he said. I did not say it then because you left, before I could find the words, and I did not pursue you because I understood that pursuing you would have been the final insult after a series of them. She waited. What I did, he said, in the music room, with Jessamine. He did not look away from her. She noted this. A man who maintained eye contact while naming his own failure was a man who had spent time with the failure and had stopped trying to manage it into something more comfortable. It was a betrayal, not a mistake, not a lapse of judgment. A betrayal of you, of what you had agreed to, of what I had asked you to agree to. He paused. He was looking at the edge of her desk, the place where the shipping ledger met the correspondence, and she recognized the look of a man gathering himself for the part that cost the most. I have spent 5 years understanding what I destroyed in that room, not the engagement. The engagement was a contract, and contracts can be dissolved. What I destroyed was your trust, and Jessamine's future, and the possibility that you would ever look at me without seeing that afternoon first. He met her eyes. I'm not asking you to forgive me. I'm asking you to know that I understand what I did, and that I have not organized it into something less than what it was." She looked at him across her desk. She looked at the man who had stood in a music room with his hand on her sister's face, and who was now sitting in her study, naming the thing he had done with the precision of a man who had done his own accounting and had not adjusted the figures in his favor. "I knew," she said, "in the music room. I knew before you turned around. I knew from the sound of her laugh, the private one, the one she only used with people she trusted. I heard her use it with you, and I knew everything in the time it takes to open a door." He was quiet. "I did not leave because I was destroyed," she said. "I left because I understood that staying would have required me to break something I was not willing to break. My composure, my dignity, the version of myself that I had spent 23 years building." She paused. "The ring on the pianoforte, do you remember it?" "I've thought about the sound of it," he said, "every day for 5 years. It was the quietest thing I've ever done," she said. "And it was the loudest." He looked at her. The expression on his face was the one she had been watching build since November. Not the assessing attention, not the managed composure. The one underneath both. The one that had nothing defensive in it and nothing performed. "You set it down," he said. "I set it down," she said. "And I meant it." The study was quiet. The December light came through the window. The shipping ledgers and the harbor charts and the 5 years between them sat in the room like furniture that had always been there. "Elowen," he said. "There is something you do not know," she said. She did not plan this. She had spent 5 years planning the opposite of this, constructing a fortress of silence around the one piece of information she had decided he would never have. But she was sitting across from a man who had just named his own betrayal without qualification, and she understood, with the instinct she had inherited from her father, that meeting honesty with concealment was its own kind of betrayal, and she was not willing to add it to the account. "Emmerich," she said. He looked at her. The name registered. She watched it register. The name of the boy he had seen at the bridge, the boy his steward had mentioned, the boy he had looked at for one moment longer than the information required. "He is 4 years old," she said. "He will be 5 in February. He was born in 1820, in Bristol, in a snowstorm." She watched him do the math. She watched it cross his face, the calculation that began with February and moved backward through the months, to June, to the engagement, to the weeks before the music room, to the last time they had been together in the garden at Thornfield, in the late spring light, when she had still believed that what existed between them was real and whole and hers. "February," he said. "Conceived in June," she said. "I confirmed it the morning of the ball. The morning of the day I found you with Jessamine." Something moved in his expression that she had never seen before. Not the composure, not the fracture in the composure. Something more fundamental than either. The look of a man receiving information that rearranges every piece of furniture in every room he has occupied for the past 5 years. "I was coming to tell Jessamine," she said. "That morning. I wanted to tell her first, before the ball, before I told you. She was my sister and my closest friend, and I wanted her face to be the first face I saw when I said the words." She paused. The quality of the pause was the quality of a woman who had carried this for 5 years and was setting it down the way she had set down the ring, deliberately, precisely, and with the understanding that once it was placed, it could not be retrieved. "I found her with you instead. And I decided in the carriage, on the road from Thornfield, that the child I was carrying was no longer information that belonged to you." He stood. The movement was not managed. It was the involuntary standing of a man whose body could not contain what his mind was processing while seated. He walked to the window. He looked out at the December garden, the bare trees, the south field beyond, and somewhere in the house she could hear Emmerich voice, distant and clear, saying something to Mrs. Calloway about the cat. His eyes, the Duke said. His voice had dropped below any register she had heard from him. At the bridge, I saw his eyes. He has your eyes, she said. He has had them since the day he was born. Gray, with the darker ring at the edge. I see them every morning. He turned from the window. She saw his face and understood that she was looking at a man who was experiencing the simultaneous arrival of two things that could not coexist comfortably: the joy of a child he did not know he had, and the grief of 5 years he could not recover. You carried this alone, he said. I was not alone. I had my father. I had Mrs. Calloway. I had Emmerich. You carried the decision alone, the decision not to tell me. Yes. Why? She looked at him with the complete attention she had brought to everything since she was 15, the attention that unnerved people, that she had never softened. Because you were standing in a music room with your hand on my sister's face, she said. Because the man I saw in that room was not a man I trusted with the most important thing I had ever been given. Because a child is not a negotiation, and not a contract, and not a reason to remain in a room you need to leave. He was quiet for a long time, the kind of quiet that meant a man wasn't constructing a response, but was allowing the truth to finish arriving. I want to meet him, he said. Properly. He is in the kitchen, she said, with Mrs. Calloway and the cat. Allawan. His voice broke on her name. It was the first imperfect thing she had ever heard from him, the first sound that had nothing of management in it, and she received it with the attention it deserved, which was complete. Go, she said. The kitchen is through the corridor, second door on the left. He will be sitting at the table. He likes to draw ships. He looked at her. She looked at him. 5 years of silence and careful walls, and the construction of a life without him, and she was sending him to the kitchen to meet the boy who drew ships and had his father's gray eyes. He does not know, she said, who you are. He knows he has a father who is not present. I have not lied to him. I have simply not provided the details. What do I say to him? She thought about this. She thought about a man who had managed rooms and counties and estates since he was 20, asking her what to say to a child in a kitchen. You say hello, she said, and then you ask him about the ships. He stayed for 2 hours. She did not go to the kitchen. She sat at her desk in the study and listened to the sounds that came through the corridor. Emmerich's voice, high and certain, explaining something about masts. The lower voice, the Duke's, asking questions with the focused attention she recognized. Mrs. Calloway's footsteps, the particular rhythm of a woman who understood what was happening and was giving it the space it required. When he emerged, he stood in the doorway of the study and looked at her, and his expression had changed in a way she was going to need time to understand. It was the expression of a man who had walked into a kitchen and met the evidence of everything he had lost, and everything that still existed despite the losing, and who was not yet sure what to do with the weight of both. He drew me a ship, he said. He was holding a piece of paper. She could see from across the room that it was one of Emmerich's drawings, the detailed, careful kind, with the rigging lines that he insisted on getting right, because his mother had shown him how rigging worked, and he took accuracy seriously. He takes accuracy seriously, she said. I noticed. He looked at the drawing. Allawan. Yes. I'm going to say something, and I want you to hear it as what it is, and not as what it would have been 5 years ago. She waited. I want to be in his life, not as a visitor, not as a twice-yearly presence who arrives with gifts and leaves before the difficult parts. I want to be present. For the ships and the rigging and the parts that require accuracy. She looked at him. That is not a small thing to offer. It is not a small thing to have missed. She thought about the 5 years. She thought about the walls she had built, the self-reliance, the careful independence. She thought about Lady Ashgrove saying she had overbuilt the structure. She thought about a man sitting in her kitchen for 2 hours, learning about rigging from a boy who had his eyes. I am not interested, she said, in a man who is present because of guilt. I am not present because of guilt. He set the drawing on her desk beside the shipping ledger. I am present because I sat in your kitchen and asked a boy about ships, and he explained the difference between a brig and a bark with the same precision his mother uses when she explains cargo tonnage projections. And I understood that I am looking at the 2 most important people I have ever encountered, and that I nearly lost both of them because of a failure I committed in a room I did not bother to close the door of. She looked at the drawing on her desk. She looked at the man who had placed it there beside her work, beside her ledgers and her charts, and the life she had built without him. This is not a proposal, she said. It is an assessment, he said, preceding a proposal. I have learned, somewhat late, that assessments should come first. And what does the assessment conclude? He looked at her with the expression she had watched build since November, the one stripped of every defense and every managed surface, the one that had nothing of the music room in it, and nothing of the 5 years of silence. That I have not come too late, he said. That is what I am asking. She thought about the ring on the pianoforte, the quiet sound of it, the 5 years since, the boy in the kitchen who drew ships with accurate rigging. You have not come too late, she said. Her father received the news from his bed in the Bristol house, where his health had taken him permanently by December. Elowen sat beside him and told him, with the directness that was their shared language, and Oswin Thackeray looked at his daughter with the attention that had never in 28 years missed anything important. The man from the music room, he said. The man from the kitchen, she said. He sat with Emmerich for 2 hours and learned about rigging. Can he be trusted with you? She considered this honestly. He sat on a kitchen floor and let a 4-year-old boy explain the difference between a brig and a bark, she said. And he listened with his whole attention. That is the version of a man I can trust. Her father nodded. The version that listens, he said. Yes, that is the one that holds. They were married in April at the church in Colvern that sat between the harbor and the inland road, which was geographically practical and personally correct. And also, Elowen had noted, when she first saw it in November, a beautiful church with a Norman arch and stone floors that had been there since the 12th century. She wore dark blue, which was her color, and her mother's earrings, which were simple and right. And she walked in on her own because her father could not be there, and she had decided, sometime in March, that walking alone was not a compromise, but a statement. And the statement was that she had been walking under her own power for 5 years, and this was not the day to pretend otherwise. Emmerich walked beside her. He was wearing a coat that was slightly too large, because he was growing faster than Mrs. Calloway could keep pace with, and he held his mother's hand with the seriousness of a boy who understood that something important was happening and intended to be accurate about his role in it. Lady Ashgrove was there. Mrs. Calloway was there, in the 2nd row, with a handkerchief she had no intention of needing and every intention of using. The county was there because the marriage of a duke was an occasion, and the marriage of this duke to this woman was an occasion with the additional quality of a story Somerset had been following since October, with the invested attention of people who had known something was going to happen and had been patient enough to wait for it. Aldrich stood at the front of the church and watched her walk toward him, and his expression had nothing of management in it, nothing of the music room, nothing of the man who had failed to close a door. He was looking at the woman who had set a ring on a pianoforte and walked out of his life with the composure of someone who understood the difference between leaving and being driven away. And he was looking at the boy beside her, the boy with gray eyes and accurate rigging and a coat that was slightly too large. And his face held both of them with the wholly unconcealed attention of a man who understood what he had been given and what it had cost. Elowen reached the front of the church. She looked at Aldrich. She thought about the music room and the pianoforte and the sound of the ring on polished wood. She thought about the carriage and the Somerset Road and the hand pressed flat against her stomach. She thought about 5 years of independence and self-reliance and a boy who drew ships at the kitchen table. She thought about all the versions of the ring. The first, placed on her finger in a garden, with the seriousness of a contract. The second, removed and set on the pianoforte, with the precision of a woman who was not discarded, but who chose to set something down. The third, the absence, the bare finger that had spoken louder than the sapphire for 5 years, in every room, at every commission meeting, across every negotiation and every handshake over a broken bridge. She had thought about the fourth version. She had thought about what it would look like and what it would mean. She had decided, sometime in March, that it would not be the sapphire. The sapphire belonged to 3 previous duchesses, and to a music room, and to a version of herself that no longer existed. She had told Aldrich this, and he had understood, and what he had brought to the church was a ring she had not seen before. Not a family stone, not an heirloom, a new ring, plain gold, chosen for her alone, carrying no one else's history. He held it out. She did not extend her hand. She took the ring from his palm. She held it for 1 moment in her closed hand, the same way she had held the sapphire before setting it down, and Aldrich watched her hold it, and she saw in his face that he remembered the gesture, remembered the pianoforte, remembered the sound. She put it on herself, not his hand placing it on hers. Her hand, her choice, her action. She slid it onto her finger with the same deliberate care with which she had once removed a ring in a music room, and the gesture said everything the previous gestures had said, and reversed all of it. I am not setting something down. I'm picking something up. I see you. I am not leaving. I am here. Emmerich, standing beside her, looked up at both of them with the focused attention of a child who was making sure this was being done correctly. Elowen took her son's hand with her left, the one wearing the new ring, and she took Aldrich's hand with her right, the one that had set the sapphire down 5 years ago and had been empty since, and she stood in the church in Colvern between the two of them and understood completely. The best decisions, her father had always said, were the ones you understood better after you made them than before. She understood this one, not the version from the music room, not the version from the carriage, the version from now, in a church with a Norman arch, and a boy in a coat that was too large, and a man who had come through the kitchen door and asked about ships. She understood it completely.